connecting. All right, lovely. So we're going ahead. So we also have the chat function as well on the chat function should be there on your toolbar at the bottom. Depending on whether you're using your phone or a computer, sometimes it can be on the top. So you can ask questions throughout the presentation or throughout the presentations, but I will be putting them to our presenters at the end. We have a Q&A session at the end, but feel free as you're listening throughout the presentations, to pop in your questions. I'm sure there are other people that are also at the webinar who might want to answer your questions as well. So this is very much a learning situation. And then also at the Q&A session, if you want, you can use the raise your hand function and ask a question directly yourself. So you're all welcome to do that. Okay, so I'll do a brief introduction to connecting communities with peatlands. So my name is Aoife Kirk, and I am the project coordinator for connecting communities with peatlands. It is a project funded by the National Just Transition Fund, and it's led by Irish Rural Link and the Community Wetlands Forum. So really the project is very much about providing capacity building training to peatland communities in the Midlands. And this webinar is really part of that. We did a training needs assessment just late last year. And some of the feedback that came out of that was that the communities in the Midlands were really interested in learning more about peatlands themselves and building their knowledge and understanding of peatlands. So that has led to this webinar series, Building Your Bog Knowledge. So we've already completed one webinar on what is the bog. And like I said, that's recorded and you can go and check that out and watch back on our YouTube channel. And this one will also be available on YouTube in the coming days. As well as that, we have 3 more webinar series, or 3 more webinar installments, I suppose, on peatlands and culture, climate mitigation, and then also what communities can do to engage with their local peatland. So you have to go back into Eventbrite and register individually for all of those if you want to participate in those as well. Okay, so we are going to start our session. So I'm going to invite George Smith to come and talk to us today about the plants of the bog, particularly those that are intact and cut over as well. So George, if you would like to share your screen with us.
Absolutely.
Thanks, George.
I have to go back to the beginning. Oh, disaster. Now, am I still here? Notice?
Yeah, if you...
Yeah, I'm still here. Okay, can you see me? Can you see my screen?
Yes. If you make it, put it into, yeah, perfect. That's it. Work away.
Okay, that's great. So thanks very much for everybody.
Did we lose George?
Right, I'm back now.
He's back.
Yeah, I don't know why that happened. Okay,
That's okay.
Now I'm back. Hopefully I'll stay this time. Okay, thanks very much for having me along. I'm going to be talking to you today about the plants of the bog. And yeah, it's fitting that I go first. We start talking about plants first because as Denise and John, who are going to be speaking after me, know but won't admit it, plants are the most important thing about raised bogs. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to, once I can move the slide, thank you. I'm going to be taking you on a journey to the center of the bog. To start with. So if you remember last week, Maura Seekin was telling you about the different zones of the different ecotopes, of the bog. So we'll look first at the plants that are typically found on the margins of the bog, the face bank and the marginal ecotopes, and then move a little bit more into the bog, into looking at, well, let's see here, I'm just going to get my little spotlight on here. Yeah, there we go. So we're going to first look at the margins of the bog, then move a little bit more and look at the submarginal ecotopes where the conditions are getting a little bit better, a little bit wetter. And then we're going to have a look at the plants that are really typical of the active raised bog, the central and subcentral ecotopes. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about, introduce you to some of the plants that you find in flushes and soaks on the bog, which wouldn't be typical of the main part of the bog, but are found in places where nutrients are a little bit higher than in the rest of the bog. And then I'll just say briefly a couple of words on the sorts of plants you find on the Cutover bog around. Okay. There we go. Okay, so bogs, yeah, are tough places for plants. So they're very, very wet habitats, as you know, but some places, especially the margins, can sometimes be very, very dry. They're very acidic and very nutrient poor, especially nitrogen and phosphorus. And they're very exposed habitats as well. There's, if you spent any time on the bog, there's very little shelter from the rain, the wind, the sun, and everything like that. So there's very, very few species that actually can tolerate these conditions and thrive in them. And so as a result, raised bogs are not very species rich. They're not, at least in terms of vascular plants, the flowering plants. So there aren't very many species that are found on raised bogs, but the ones that you do find tend to be really specialist species with particular adaptations, that allow them to survive, on the bog, and really can't be found in most other places. So if we start out at the bog margins, yeah, as Morris was saying last week, a lot of times, when people think about plants of the bogs, you think immediately about heather, either ling heather or calluna, or cross-leaved heath, which is an erica species. Those would be the two main heather species that you find on the bog. And they are, well, they're not really typical of the wet bog middles because they prefer the drier conditions. They're found on the margins of the bog in great abundance. They dominate the margins of the bog, but you also find them in the drier parts of the middle of the bog, the active bog, on drier, more exposed hummocks and places like that. And it's interesting for a wetland plant, they really have a lot of adaptations to minimize water loss. So they've adapted to these conditions where the peat dries up and there really is very little water available. They've got very narrow leaves, which reduces transpiration, water loss from the leaves. They've got very waxy cuticles as well. So yeah, a bit strange that these wetland plants should have these dry land sort of adaptations. Then another typical plant that you might find on the bog margins would be this thing here called northern deer grass. So northern deer grass it's a member of the sedge family, and you can quite often get it in abundance on the margins of the bog, and really is a very good, the reason why I'm highlighting it here is really it's a very good indicator of degraded conditions on raised bog. You find it, more frequently in blanket bogs, but in the raised bogs, it tends to prefer the dry areas, the areas that are degraded, or there's a lot of bare peat. The most typical moss that you would find in the drier parts of the bog would be this one here, Hypnum jutlandicum. Yeah, I'm not going to make any apologies. I'm going to use the Latin names for the mosses because very few people use the common names for them, and I can't remember them myself. But I will point out this name here, Heath plat moss, which is very descriptive because it's this gray-green sort of a shape, and with a sort of a feather-like arrangement, branches coming out from the side, and the leaves are nicely curled in a way that it looks like plaited hair almost. So that's a very, very common thing you'll find. In some of the worst parts of the face bank ecotope, quite often you'll find just very tall, leggy heather and with nothing else but Hypnum jutlandicum underneath. Another marginal moss I'd like to point out is something called Campylopus intraflexus. So it's this little moss here with very distinctive white hair points. And this is actually a non-native moss. It's from New Zealand originally, and it was first found in Ireland in the 1940s, but has since spread throughout the country, and it's very common on bare peat. It's an early colonist of bare peat, and other substrates as well, like this old Reebok runner that I found dumped in a bog a few years back. So moving into where conditions are a bit wetter, the water table is higher and maybe a bit more stable, you wind up, you find Areophorums, the Bog Cottons really come into their own. So there's two main species of bog cotton that you find on the bog. The first would be hare's tail bog cotton here on the right, and common bog cotton here on the left. Now, hare's tail bog cotton, they're fairly easy to tell apart because hare's tail bog cotton only has the one flowering head, and the leaves are quite fine and narrow. And you tend to find that in pretty good bog habitat. But and it quite often can dominate large areas of the submarginal zone, and also responds quite well to re-wetting. So if you re-wet a portion of the bog or cutover, then that will be one of the species that tends to thrive in the newly wetted conditions. Common bog cotton, on the other hand, here in the middle, has several flowering heads, all on the same stem. It's an easy way to tell it apart from the hare's tail one. The leaves are much broader and quite often have this reddy tinge that you see. It's interesting that it grows in these very wet pools that you see in the photo, but it's also quite good at colonizing bare peat. It's pretty much the first thing that comes in and starts colonizing bare peat on the cutover when the turf cutters have packed up and gone. Bog cottons were used a decent bit in the past for things like stuffing mattresses and pillows. And there are even some records of them being used for making thread and cloth, but that seems to be fairly uncommon and restricted to poorer people. The reports are that it makes a fairly brittle cloth. Perhaps the prettiest plant that you're going to find on the bog is this one here in the middle, which is Bog asphodel. And its Latin name is Narthecium ossifragum. The ossifragum part means bone breaking. And where that comes from is that when people grazed bogs where Narthecium, where Bog asphodel was fairly common. When they grazed their sheep and cattle there, their bones were quite brittle because the vegetation was very low in phosphorus. It's nutrient poor. And so they associated this with the Bog asphodel, thinking that it was the Bog asphodel that was making their sheep's bones very, very brittle. If you're on the high bog, if you've got a lot of Bog asphodel, it can quite often indicate that conditions are getting a bit poorer because it tends to colonize the bog pools that have dried up and form carpets in these little hollows. And traditionally was used as a source of yellow dye. Another common plant of the submarginal zone is this one here, which is called Carnation Sedge. And it's called that because the blue-green leaves look like those of carnations. In Midlands raised bogs, it tends to indicate sort of poorer conditions, but it becomes more frequent and you find it more in better habitats the further west you go. So, in raised bogs in Roscommon, for example, or Galway, it becomes more common and not as restricted to poor quality habitats. Now, moving into the center of the bog, the active raised bog, you have another little small sedgy plant here called white-beak sedge, which loves growing in wet depressions or the edges of pools. And you can see it here actually colonizing this animal path going through the bog, where the animals have worn down a little path, and you can see that it just grows there and marks out that path quite nicely. Another spectacular flower is Bog Bean, and a lot of you'd be familiar with Bog Bean, I'm sure. It's got lovely white flowers, and it's a real bog pool sort of a plant. And it had a lot of use in traditional medicine back in the day. Herbal medicine as a tonic, a blood purifier, and for using it to bring down fever. And it does have, chemical compounds in it that actually do have medical value. You have to talk about carnivorous plants when you're talking about the bog. As I was saying earlier, the bogs are very nutrient poor environments, very poor in nitrogen and phosphorus. And so you have plants that have adapted ways, come up with ways to supplement their nutrients by eating animals. So most of you be familiar with sundews. So we have two species in the slides. There are actually three species that you can find on the bogs in Ireland. This is round leaf sundew, which is the most common one. And it is the most abundant, it's very, very abundant, in areas of active bog, but you can find it in little wet corners pretty much across the bog. And then this one here is Drasera Anglica, which I think its common name is oblong-leaved sundew, but it's got longer leaves than the round-leaved sundew. And both of these they have sticky sap on these long hairs around their leaves, and it's the sticky sap that the insects get caught in, and then they wind up dying and decaying. The plant, the insect remains fall to the ground, and then the sundews kind of take up the nutrients from their roots. Another fascinating carnivorous plant is this one here called butterwort. And it's an aquatic plant. You can see all the little yellow flowers in this bog pool here. And then I added in this botanical drawing so you can see the structure of the plant better. There are 4 species in Ireland. And what it does is it traps insects in these little bladder structures here that are kind of stuck on the roots of the plant. And so they've got little hair triggers on the sides of the bladders. And so when a little aquatic worm or insect or some other invertebrate comes along nearby, it sets off the hair trigger and the bladder opens up, sucks in the water and the insect as well, and immediately shuts. And the plant slowly suffocates and is digested inside the bladders. So fantastic little things. And not quite last, but this is definitely the best plant of the bog, or group of plants, sphagnums. So sphagnums are the bog bosses. They're what actually make the bog, as you know. And they do this to kind of, they've got a unique structure to the plant and kind of cell structure when you look under the microscope. So, I mean, sphagnums are famous for being difficult to identify. And a lot of them, you do need a lot of practice to be able to identify them to species. But, you'll know a sphagnum from any other plant, because they have this structure of a lot of dense young branches at the top, the capitulum, and then a stem going down, and then branches with leaves coming off. And you'd have usually a few hanging branches and a few spreading branches as well. And sphagnums just keep growing. That the top part of the plant just keeps growing, the capitulum just keeps going up and up and up. Whereas while the bottom part of the plant that gets buried and more or less dies, and that's what turns to peat. And of course, sphagnums are the main peat-forming plants of raised bogs. There's about 9 typical raised bog species in Ireland, and different species occupy different bog microhabitats, hummocks, lawns, and pools. So looking at some of the hummock sphagnums, there are some species form mounds or hummocks, and this structure of hummocks and mounds help actually retain water amongst the group of plants that make up the hummock there. It gets trapped inside. Probably the most common sphagnum across the bog is Sphagnum rubellum. It's kind of a small dainty sort of a sphagnum, usually red, tends to get green when it's shaded, and it's very common, widespread across the bog. Then you would have Sphagnum austinii, and it forms these tight brown to red to greenish, sort of hummocks. They're very, very tight. You can tell them by feel. It's a moss that a blind person could identify. If you hit the hummock, it sounds like a drum. They're usually, this is one of these species is usually restricted to the best parts of the bogs, and so can be quite rare on degraded bogs. But it can, because of this hummock form that holds on to moisture, it can hang on for a long time in a bog that's otherwise fairly degraded. And you can see this is a very large hummock here with my tablet sitting on it for scale. Quite a nice large hummock of it there. And this beautiful guy, this is now called Sphagnum Beathuk. Used to be called Sphagnum fuscum. I've put the old names in brackets because there have been a lot of recent name changes. So if you're reading any of the older sort of literature, they'll use the older names. So this is a lovely sort of chocolate brown to ginger brown, small sphagnum, and it forms big hummocks, very tall hummocks as well. And like Sphagnum austinii, it is tends to be restricted to the best parts of the bogs. And that's one of the first species to lose, when your bog goes into bad condition. And you can see this one here, there's been a fire recently around this, but you can see this hummock of Sphagnum Beathuk is hanging on there quite well because it stayed wet and was able to fight off the fire. It didn't burn as much as the surrounding vegetation did. So lawn sphagnums, these are the ones that they form wet lawns or occupy the upper parts of pools and hollows. So Sphagnum Papillosium is this large, chunky, yellow-brown sphagnum with hooded leaf tips, and the hoods in the leaf tips are another great way for them to hold on to water. This is a widespread, usually very common moss, one of the more common sphagnums across the bog. And it's one of the main peat forming species because it's big, chunky, forms a lot of peat, and it's fairly widespread. And another big chunky moss is Sphagnum medium, used to be known as Sphagnum magellanicum, and it's got a winey red color. And it also has these hooded leaf tips as well. It's fairly widespread, but a bit more choosy in terms of habitats than Sphagnum papillosum is. It tends to be found more often in the Midlands raised bogs, Westmeath and Offaly and places like that. And it becomes a little less common the further west you go. And then the pool sphagnums. So there's some aquatic or semi-aquatic species that are restricted to pools and hollows that are wet for at least most of the year. This one here is called Sphagnum cuspidatum. So it's a yellow-green species with very fine leaves. Hopefully you can see from the slide there. It looks like wet fur, if you pull it out of the bog pool and pick it up, that's really what it looks like. And it's a very quick colonizer as well of bog that's been newly re-wetted. So if you go and block the drains, you get some shallow water developing, that's going to be the first thing, that will come in terms of sphagnums. And then there's Sphagnum Ariculatum, formerly known as Sphagnum denticulatum. And it tends to be dark yellow, green, sometimes coppery red tones. It's called cow's horn bog moss because I don't know if you can see in this picture, some of the branches up at the top are curled like cow's horns. That's the one, yeah, Sphagnum Ariculatum is the one sticking its head out of the water. You can see Cuspidonum submerged there and how feathery it looks, under the water there. And this species is tends to be more frequent in the Western raised bogs and in blanket bogs than Midland raised bogs. So that's a quick tour over some of the sphagnums. I have to mention there's lots of other mosses and liverworts that you find on the bog. I don't have time to go into them in any detail. I'd love to, but there's a lot of them. A lot of them would be quite rare. Some very, very rare species can be found on raised bogs as well. Bogs tend to be ideal habitats for mosses and liverworts because they don't have roots, in the way that flowering plants do. So what they do is they actually take up the water through the leaves, so they need wet conditions. And so, a wetland, a bog, is an ideal habitat for them. I will have to give a special mention to one of the most interesting groups of mosses on a bog. Their specialist habitat is poo on bogs. So it's another way of overcoming those nutrient limitations, that they colonize, usually carnivore poo, foxgat in particular. And you can see there's one here. This is Sphagnum Papillosium. It's got lots of lovely capsules there growing, completely covering this bit of fox poo there on a bog. And then this one is Tetraplodon Manioides here, growing on fox poo, on the bog. And you can see their strategy is they come in, colonize, the animal droppings, send up lots of capsules, reproduce as fast as they can before the animal droppings, decompose into the bog. And a lot of these actually have sticky spores, fairly sticky spores, to promote dispersal by flies. And so they hitchhike a ride on the flies from poo to poo to poo all across the bog. Now, flushes and soaks are a different type of habitat that you find on bogs.
George, you've 1 minute left.
1 minute left. I'll be very quick. Okay,
Thanks.
and so these are parts where the surface water flow is concentrated, which gives you more nutrients, which allows a different set of species to thrive. So birch trees, for example, can be found in wet flushes. It can be a sign of drying bog, but they also form this fantastic, lovely habitat here called Bog Woodland. It's a habitat that's rare at European level. Purple moorgrass, this pale tussocky grass, quite often you find in drier flushes, the edge of the bog. Have to mention cranberry, of course, very small plant you find on moss hummocks. Bog myrtle, sweet smelling shrub, used to be used for medicinal purposes, flavoring beer even, still is today. And then Sphagnum Pollution, which is this lovely large sphagnum that forms deep mounds, in bog woodland. Not a plant of the high open bog, but more of flushes and bog woodland. Last word on Cutover Bog. Cutover Bog is really a bit of a mess. Cutover bogs, they're very, very variable environments, depending on how long it's been since turf cutting stopped, on the slope and topography of the cutover, are there drains left and how well they're functioning, how deep is the peat. And so because this environment is very variable, you get a hodgepodge of all the plants I've been talking about so far. Any or all of these plants could be found in close proximity. With the addition of, if you have where peat has cut down into the fen peat, and where there's influence to the groundwater, you can wind up with pockets of fen in the bog, and you get a whole different range of sedges and mosses that are not found on the high bog. Don't have time to talk about any of those, so I'll just say thanks very much for listening.
Thanks so much, George. That was actually so fascinating. I don't think I knew there were that many species of sphagnum moss. So I'll be keeping an eye out the next time I'm out on the bog. And hopefully when we get to the Q&A session, there'll be plenty more questions about other kinds of mosses. So you'll be able to go into that a little bit more. Thank you so much. That was really, really fantastic.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Denise O'Meara. Denise Omar is a lecturer with WIT, and she is presenting to us today on the wild mammals of the bog, and will give us kind of an overview of Irish wildlife and to discuss the ways that they've surveyed for otters and pine martens and squirrels on some of Ireland's bogs and woodlands. So Denise, if you have, yeah, perfect. You've got your screen there already. So take it away.
Thanks very much. Just here this evening. I loved George's talk, and he's absolutely right. Plants are the most important element of the bog, and without them we wouldn't have it or the habitat. For the mammals I'm going to introduce you to this evening. So this photograph here is actually of Abbeyleix Bog, where most of my examples come from, and I think Abbeyleix is a nice example in the sense that it's close to a town, and it's got a huge variety of different habitats. So I'm sure most people will find something relevant or something that they'll be able to relate to from it. So I thought we'd start off by talking about what small mammals can potentially occur on the bog. And basically any of the small mammals can occur in or near the bog. And we have a selection of native and non-native mammals. And so I suppose our native ones would include the likes of the wood mouse. Some people call it the field mouse. And the pygmy shrew here is another example of a native species. And well, considered native anyway would be the house mouse as well. And the likes of the brown rat has been here for an awful long time as well. Some of the more recent small mammals that have arrived into Ireland within, you know, I suppose the bankvole we think came into Ireland about 100 years ago, and that's this little fella down here, and they've spread across a good track of the country at this stage. And one of the more recent species that was discovered here by John, actually, who will be talking next, is the greater white-toothed shrew, and they were discovered in around 2005, and they've spread across large parts of the island as well, and they actually compete with this little fella here, our native pygmy shrew. And the dormouse then was discovered in Kildare within, I suppose, the last 5 or 6 years as well. And I haven't come across any references of dormice in bogs, but they could possibly as well. So we do have a nice little selection of small mammals. And of course, small mammals are important for our birds of prey and for providing food for carnivores as well. So they're an important group of species. I suppose then some of the smallish mammals, I don't even know if that's a category, that we might find in the bog include hedgehogs and squirrels. So any of the bogs that are surrounded by any bog woodland, and some of them might even have, you know, some native woodland, or even, you know, might have coniferous woodland in the areas that surround them. You could potentially find squirrels in some of those as well. So in the likes of Abbeyleix Bog, they have a nice little red squirrel population. And most of the woodlands in the Midlands could potentially contain grey squirrels as well. But in recent years, they have been somewhat in decline. And some of the carnivores and mustelids that we might come across include the red fox, which could potentially occur anywhere. Otters, believe it or not, can occur in any area that you have water. You can find an otter, and we have come across them in Abbeyleix Bog, and they can of course occur in any wet area. Then you might also come across the American mink. The American mink was introduced into Ireland for fur farming originally, and some of them escaped and more of them were released, but they went ahead then and established a population. So they do occur in most areas as well, and they can cause problems for ground nesting birds, and most areas would try to remove them if they come across them. And then anywhere that has some soil that can be dug, you may be able to find badgers. So in Abbey Lakes Bog, we have come across some badger sets, and there are certainly badger sets adjacent to the bog. And the bog itself then can actually provide some habitat for foraging for them, even if they don't have their sets in them. So bogs can actually contain badgers. And one of my favorite species, the pine marten, anywhere that you have any selection of woodland or trees surrounding a bog area, even scrub is enough, can provide enough habitat for the pine marten. That's an area where you can find them. So some of the work I've done in Abbey Lakes has involved a lot of work with the pine marten. And then this little fellow over here is the stoat. And I don't have a good picture of a stoat because I only ever get a fleeting glimpse. And I think that's how most of us would consider the stoat, because he's so fast and so small. But again, stoats can hunt anywhere, and the bog also provides habitat for the stoat. Now, I can't know anything about deer. So the photographs of deer will be about as much as I'll be able to tell you about them. Now, deer can occur on bogs as well. They'll cross over between farmland into woodlands and everything, and they are getting more common in some parts of the country. So the red deer, there's kind of a unique population that's found down in County Kerry and Killarney National Park, but there are a lot of other populations around the country as well. And even in Abbey Lakes Bog, there were some red deer, and they were originally farmed in the area, and some of them escaped and established a population. And then we have other deer as well around the country. We have the sika deer, and we have fallow deer. They tend to be the most common. And you can also get hybridization occurring between some of the deer species as well, that they can interbreed. And then this other little fella down here is the muntjac, and the muntjac is about the size of a Labrador. They're considered an invasive species in that they can cause problems to woodland, and they cause a lot of problems in parts of the UK in car accidents and stuff, because they're small. They're about the size of a Labrador dog, and if their numbers can get quite high, they can be problematic. But like that, bogs can provide pretty good habitat for deer species as well. And of course, bats. We forget about bats, but bogs can provide very good hunting grounds for bats, particularly areas maybe around bog edges where they have different, like the example of this photograph up here, where you might have some trees and things like that at the edge of the woodland. They provide lovely foraging habitat for bats. So we actually have 9 different species of bats in Ireland. Some of the more common species include the common and the soprano pipistrelle and the Leisler's bat. They tend to be the most common species throughout the country, and they tend to be found pretty much everywhere. Then, of course, Daubenton's bat is kind of a water bat, in the sense that they tend to hunt over water bodies and rivers and stuff like that. So there's a good chance that you're going to find a Daubenton's bat in a wetland area. And the likes of the brown long-eared bat, they like to kind of roost in buildings and things like that. So if you have a wetland that's close to a church, because the brown long-eared bats like to roost in churches, for instance, that could mean that the bog adjacent to it might provide a good habitat for it. Nathusius pipistrelle, this little fella here in the middle, then they're a lot rarer, and they tend to be more common up around some of the big lakes and things like that. So the chances of coming across an Nathusius pipistrelle is fairly rare. And then the whiskered bat and natterer's bat are 2 kind of woodland bat species. Again, trickier to find, but they can potentially occur in some of those areas. And then Ireland's rarest and I suppose most highly protected bat is the lesser horseshoe bat. And the lesser horseshoe bat is very unique in the sense it's got this little horseshoe shaped face, and they only occur in parts of the west of Ireland and they tend to occur around kind of wooded valleys, and places like Killarney National Park provide the ideal habitat for those little guys, not the type of bat you're going to find in, you know, a bog in the middle of Ireland. So this is just a full list of our bat species. What I wanted to kind of get onto then was to talk about ways that you could actually look for signs of wildlife in your bogs and wetlands. And this time of year is perfect to look for signs of otters. And in the bog, there's lots of little water bodies, streams, and then there's areas that have drains that have been blocked and things like that. And all of those areas can actually provide good hunting grounds for otters. And this time of the year, they'll be eating frogs on the bog, and their diet is just full of frogs. So even like later on in the summer, you may not be able to find signs of otters that easily on the bog. This time of year is ideal for them. They'll even come into bogs to look for otters, or to look for frogs. They love frogs. And the kind of places that you look for otter signs or activity will be areas that I suppose look like something obvious in the land. So bridges are actually ideal, and if you have any kind of a stream or a bridge maybe at the edge of a bog or anything like that, maybe on the road or something, that would be the first kind of place I would tend to look for signs of otters, because they always mark bridges for some reason. And you can look for signs of footprints, and you can look for signs of otter sprains. Otter sprains are poos basically. And I'll show you an example now on the next page, but bridges are a good spot for that. And then of course, even just walking along some of these drains and things like that, what you might be able to find is like a mound or a grassy tussock. And any of these kind of areas, sometimes the otters will like leave a spraint on them, and you might be able to spot their signs. Other things then to look for would be like kind of muddy slides in and out of streams and drains, and that might be where the otter is entering and leaving the water. So this is my colleague Edel when we were doing a survey for otters in Abbey Leaks, and it was around March time that we had a very successful otter survey there. And Edel is collecting some otter sprains here that we took back for some DNA work at the time. But this is an example of an otter sprain over here on the right, and it is just stuffed with frog bones. So they've absolutely gorged themselves with frogs this time of the year. And of course, they'll eat other things as well, like insect larvae, and they'll eat eels and any small trout or salmon or anything like that that are in the waterways. They'll eat all of those kind of things, and they'll even eat like small animals and birds as well if they find them. You know, they're opportunistic, so they will they have a very varied diet. And Abbey Leaks Bog has provided, I suppose, a really nice opportunity for us to survey pine marten there. The bog in Abbey Leaks is surrounded by wet woodland and some coniferous woodland as well. And the pine marten are found throughout that kind of area. And we surveyed for them as we've used these hair tubes. And they're just a bit of sewer pipe that we've wired up to the tree, and we add in a bit of chicken to lure in the pine marten, and we have a little sticky patch at the edge of it. And when the pine marten comes along to get chicken, its hair gets stuck in it, and I've been able to use that then for DNA analysis. And this kind of work has been great because we've been able to involve, you know, groups of people from Abbey Leaks in the project, and it's been a nice way to get people involved in wildlife surveying. You can also look for pine martens. Pine marten will mark their territory as well, but the thing with them is that they can look quite like foxcats, so it can be a bit trickier. So I wonder, oh yeah, so this is my example of the hair tube here as well. So this is just the inside photo of the chicken wired to the tube, and the hair patch. And this is the hair then belonged to the pine marten. Now, I hope this plays. This is just an example of wildlife camera video that I would have stuck up in Abbey Leaks, and we have some young pine marten kits. Of course, it won't. Wait, no, I'll just. Oh yeah, here we go. So these are two kits that were born in the bog. You can see some heather there in the background, and it's actually like a Scots pine that the little fella just jumped off of. And normally, pine marten would like build a den in an old cavity in a tree. But a lot of the trees, obviously in Abbey Leaks and other bogs as well, at the edges of them, they would be quite young. And in this case, the pine marten actually dug a den into the peat, and they made a den in there, which is very unusual and not something that pine marten would typically do. It's a bit unsafe for them as well to be breeding in underground sites like that, because the kits would be vulnerable to predation by foxes and potentially even badgers and other pine marten and dogs and anything like that as well. So you can see there that the kits are very playful as well when they're young, and they're full of beans basically. So in order to I suppose help enhance some of the habitat for pine marten in Abbey Leaks, what we did was we put up some pine marten den boxes, and the Vincent Wildlife Trust developed a den box that the pine marten will use for nesting, kind of like to rest, but also maybe even to have their kits if they can't find a suitable site within tree cavities. This is David Tosh here on the left-hand side, and what we did was we got funding from the Heritage Council, and we got the local men's shed in Portlaoise to build the boxes. And we had a day out in the bog where we put up a few of the boxes. I can't say I did much of it now, but I went along, and it was just a really nice day to be out there with everyone. And then afterwards, we've been monitoring the boxes since to see if the pine marten are using them. So they actually use them quite a bit in the evening time, or kind of like in the winter time in particular, to rest in and stuff during the day. I think maybe once or twice they might have used them to have their kits, but in the last while they haven't used them as much. And I don't know if that's because they're breeding elsewhere or they've found something better. But it's just an example of an enhancement that can be done in any kind of woodland to provide habitat for pine marten. And we use similar approaches to survey for squirrels. You can use a little hair tube, the same idea for pine marten, except you place it horizontally rather than vertically, and you bait it with the likes of, you know, maize and nuts and seeds and things like that. And another thing another little enhancement you can put in an area for squirrels might be squirrel feeders, and that would encourage the squirrels to stay in the area and to feed them. You obviously have to watch out for grey squirrels then, that you're not, you know, introducing them to each other and things like that. And trail cameras are very useful then as well to, you know, collect images of the wildlife that you have present. Bat boxes are another enhancement that can be used in the bogs, particularly at the edges and even, you know, in the surrounding areas, to encourage wildlife to forage more over the bog habitat as well. So these are wooden boxes that can be made by the likes of men's sheds as well and things like that, community groups. And they're cheap to make and they're easy enough to put up. And this other box that I have here then is called a Schwegler box. It's made out of woodcrete and they last an awful lot longer, but they cost a lot more money. But they are better insulated and lots of different bat species will use them. So they are quite useful. And of course, bat walks and things like that using a bat detector are a great way to kind of involve community groups, especially in the summer months, that you can just go out for a walk and see what bat species you're picking up in the area. And I suppose just to kind of say as well that, like, No, it's not just the bog that's important for some of the wildlife, but some of the buildings that surround it, or that might be kind of adjacent to it. So like old farm buildings and churches, and even like modern houses as well can provide roost sites for bats, and they'll be there in summer and then they'll head off again in the winter time. So they're only kind of summer visitors, so to speak. So it's worth even putting up, bat boxes in some of the local areas surrounding bogs as well. So that's it. A quick tour of that occur on the bogs, and how you might actually share, encourage them to be present.
Thanks so much, Denise. That was really, really fascinating. Yeah, wow, like so many small rodents, some of them that I've I never would have come across before. Yeah, it's amazing. What's right on our doorstep and still haven't gone out to explore and find that out, so I'll be sure to try and find some of these little creatures the next time I'm around, but I'm sure they like to hide. That's great, thank you so much. Okay, so we'll move on to our third and final speaker of the evening, John Lusby. John, thanks so much, you've got your screen already up there, super. So John is Conservation Officer with Birdwatch Ireland, and his presentation this evening is on the current importance and future potential of raised bogs for breeding birds. And John, if you want to take it away.
Yeah, thanks very much, Aoife, and delighted to be contributing to the Build Your Bog Knowledge webinar series, and hopefully add a bit more on top of George's and Denise's excellent presentations to, I suppose, showcase the importance of bogs. And I'm going to focus on raised bogs for birds. So it's a particular area of interest of mine, and I suppose I naturally gravitated towards raised bogs because of some of the bird species that I've been focusing on. Raised bogs are particularly important for them. But something that I've really fallen in love with over the last number of years. So I'm going to share some of that, and also some of the work we're recently doing is looking at how bog restoration efforts may impact or may benefit different bird species and priority bird species. So I'll share a bit about that work that we've been focusing on recently as well. So to start with, I'm not going to dwell too much on the history of bogs, how they're formed, but I think you're all probably experts in that area at this stage through this webinar series. But just to give a brief overview, so I'm obviously focusing on raised bogs, which are shown there in pink. So mostly confined to the central plain, to the Midlands. And our other peatland sites are obviously blanket bogs as well as fens, and you can see the blanket bogs there more so the shallow peat, more typical of the mountainous areas and typically in the west. And there is a difference in terms of the different bird communities that use and that are associated with the different types of peatlands, with the different types of bogs. So with blanket bogs, with raised bogs being deeper peat, so accumulations of deep peat up to about 12 meters, it can reach up to 12 meters in depth, and where glacial lakes have become overgrown and have filled in, and then eventually as the bog grows, forms that characteristic dome shape, which is fed in predominantly with groundwater, which gives rise to the acidic and nutrient poor conditions that George described so well, and which, and again, similar to as George describes in relation to the plants, raised bogs, they're not typified by a high diversity of species, so they don't support a huge range of bird species, but they definitely punch above their weight when it comes to the species that they do support in terms of their conservation value. And many of our rarest, in fact, bird species are associated with and dependent on raised bogs, so of huge value, conservation value from that perspective. Many, or at least some of our raised bogs are protected either through national or European legislation, either as national heritage areas or special areas of conservation, but many also don't have the same protection status. But even the ones that are, I think it's fair to say that that the majority at least have been influenced by human activities, and many unfortunately in a degraded state. And even those where there are still active raised bogs and which are relatively intact, still obviously bear the signs of past use and of drainage, of drying out, and of turf cutting. This is just a bog that I'm particularly familiar with, an aerial view of it, which is Carnivorous Bog, which is quite a large raised bog, one of the largest here in the west, and it's just this is in East Galway near Mount Bellew, and it's one that we focused quite a bit on in terms of looking at the bird life, looking at the bird species that use and that are present on this bog. But even as you can see, there is still active raised bog at this site, but also you can see there on the fringes, you can see the drainage ditches, you can see the signs where turf cutting has occurred, no longer occurring, but you can still see the signs of its past use. But really interesting site, and this site, Carnivorous, as well as several other raised bogs, are currently the focus of restoration works, which is fantastic. And there's huge benefits of that, both from perspective of climate mitigation, of the other ecosystem services that important that raised bogs provide, such as water filtration, but also as well for the biodiversity value. And you can see here, this is a peat dam, one of thousands which have been installed in these sites which are being restored. And this is part of the Living Bog project, which is focused on the restoration of 12 raised bogs in the Midlands. So it's all about re-wetting, providing those conditions that sphagnum will grow, that will form peat forming conditions. So as part of that, what we wanted to do is to look and see how these restoration works will affect either positively or negatively breeding bird species, and particularly priority bird species, because we're just at the start. It's really exciting, but we're just at learning, about these restoration projects, and they're obviously long-term investments, long-term projects. So now is the time to be gathering this information to, so we can look forward and try and predict, how these changes will affect the biodiversity of these bogs, but also as well how that will inform the management of these sites. And I suppose, as I mentioned, raised bogs, they're particularly important for, as I say, that there's not that many species that occur on them or that breed on them, particularly on the high bog, more so on some of the fringe habitats. But those species that do occur on raised bogs and that do breed on raised bogs or in proximity to raised bogs are really, really important species. And I suppose, look, all bird species are important in their own right, but when I say important, it's in relation to their conservation status. Some of our most endangered species, the ones that have been in serious decline. And just to give you some examples, are species such as, also some of our most charismatic species, iconic species, such as snipe, such as curlew, another breeding wader, such as red grouse, such as merlin. So raised bogs are hugely important habitats for these birds. And not only the high bog, but also the edges, supporting, as George said, areas like birch woodland, like the Scots pine woodland around the edges of the bog. So they do provide a rich mosaic of habitats, and obviously the different species require different habitat requirements on and around the bog, and I'll talk a bit more about those species. But just to give you an example of the importance of raised bogs, this is the list, the most recent list of the birds of conservation concern, which is a list that we produce of the conservation status of all birds which breed in Ireland. And we rate them on a traffic light system, red, amber, and green, with red being those that are most endangered, that meet certain criteria, which places them on the red list, which essentially means that they've declined, or that their populations are endangered. And just to show you, raised bogs, even though obviously they're a small proportion in terms of the surface area of the country, they hold quite a high number of our species of conservation concern, species such as red grouse, woodcock I've put on as an honorary raised bog bird, even though they don't breed on the high bog, but they're typically associated with some of the edge habitats. Also kestrel, which is a recent addition to the red list of birds of conservation concern because they've declined. Meadow pipit, And then some of the breeding waders, which I'm sure you're familiar with, curlew, snipe and redshank. And that's just some of them. Other species will use raised bogs such as barn owl, such as swift for foraging. So hugely important habitat, and not only raised bogs, but upland birds. So species typically using peatlands and other upland habitats. They're unfortunately the most represented group on the red list of birds conservation concern. So that shows in one sense how valuable these habitats are, but also in another sense, the fact that these habitats are under pressure, and that's the reason that unfortunately the species associated with them are shown to be in trouble and have experienced population declines. What really puts importance on raised bogs and other peatland and upland habitats. So I'm going to focus a little bit on a study that we're currently involved in, and which we started last year and are continuing this year, which is looking at the importance of certain raised bogs, what species occur there, and looking forward as to how the changes to these bogs may affect these breeding birds. And so far we focused on 5 raised bog sites in the Midlands, 3 in Offaly, 1 in Longford and 1 in Cavan. And these are all sites which are part of the Living Bog project, which, as I said, is a bog restoration project, which has focused on 12 raised bogs, these being 5 of them, and have started practical restoration works, essentially re-wetting these bogs. So we set out to basically assess what bird species are present on these raised bogs, to look at where they were present, what sort of habitats they were using on the bog, and also to look at their abundances, their density, so that we could compare with other raised bogs in the country, but also other types of bogs such as blanket bogs, and then to try to look and see, based on their habitat associations, how using the hydrological models and using the predicted changes to the bog in terms of the re-wetting and the changes to the ecotopes, how that would likely affect the bird species present. And then obviously over time, we have the baseline information now, 10 years time, 20 years time, but hopefully as these sites improve, we can look back and see how this has affected the bird species. And I must say it was so pleasant to be, for a change, working on sites where that the future is secured and that they're only going in one direction, which is the right direction in terms of the sites are improving, which is a really nice feeling. Unfortunately, normally for me, it's the opposite way around. So absolutely, and I would say that these sites that we did focus on are probably some of the finest representative, the finest samples of raised bogs, of intact raised bogs. So maybe the picture that I'm painting in terms of the bird species is probably more positive than likely other raised bogs. So just to give you, and just as Denise showed, I suppose it's useful to look behind the scenes and see how we went about the survey and what type of methods we used. So we used a range of different survey methods, and the idea being that obviously different bird species are, some are easy to detect, others are more difficult to detect. Some occur, are active at different times of the day and night. So say, for example, woodcock and long-eared owl, active at dusk and during the night. So we catered the methods essentially to try and carry out the survey as comprehensively as possible to essentially identify all bird species breeding or using the bog. And one of the most important methods was transect survey. So essentially walking a predefined route and recording all the birds either side of that route on the high bog, and working out then the distance that they were from the route. That allowed us to establish what sort of abundances and densities they occurred in. And this was really, really comprehensive. Quite a slog, as anyone that's traipsed around raised bogs, and particularly bogs like these, which are in good condition and therefore wet, would know. So very good for keeping fitness levels up. But amazing information that was gathered, and this just gives you an idea of the routes that we used. This bog here is Ardegullion Bog, an amazing site up in County Longford. And then we plot all the observations that we have, either by seeing birds or by hearing them. And then another survey method, maybe a little less strategic, but nonetheless important, is roving, which then caters for the habitats along the fringe of the bog, which we weren't picking up because they were quite inaccessible from the transect surveys. So essentially the more typical woodland and scrub species in these habitats. And then the transect surveys, they're not going to pick up species that are maybe, you know, a little bit more cryptic, or that require a bit more time and patience. So the likes of our raptors like sparrowhawk and kestrel and merlin, as well as corvid species, we use vantage point surveys, which is essentially picking a good vantage point and surveying the area and recording the species. And then woodcock surveys out at dusk, because these are active at that time. And that's when they have their display flights, a perfect time of year now at the moment to watch them, and their roading flight, which is their territorial flight, and also then long-eared owl, which are actually surprisingly easy to detect, very difficult most times of the year, but when they have young in the nest, they're very, very noisy, very vocal, so very easy to pick up on a still, calm night just by listening for them. So to give you an idea, and I think it was hugely positive from our perspective in terms of the findings. But again, I would say, you know, these sites are probably the cream of the crop in terms of in terms of a lot of our raised bogs in terms of their condition. But in total, we recorded 62 species. And just to show you the importance of these sites, so of those 62 species across the 5 raised bogs, 20 are of conservation concern. So a third essentially are of conservation concern, which is either they're on the red list of birds of conservation concern or the amber list of birds of conservation concern. So it is quite a high number in terms of 62 species, which was, you know, I suppose reflective of the intensive nature of the survey, but also just shows the importance, the fact that a third of those essentially are of conservation concern. And when we looked at the species diversity and also the species density, it was quite high compared to other raised bog surveys in the past, and also looking at to compare to information from blanket bogs as well. And again, probably reflective of both the survey methods used, but also as well the condition of these bogs and the fact that they can support these birds. And I'm just going to Aoife, please jump in if I'm running tight for time, because I do have a tendency to run over, but I'll keep going.
We're okay for the moment.
Good. I'll keep going for as long as I can. But just to give you an idea of some of the species, and I'm going to start with maybe some of the I won't say more important, but I'll say more endangered species or red listed species. And one which is a characteristic bird of the bog and raised bogs is this bird, which is absolutely wonderful bird, the snipe. And they are still relatively widespread, but they are in decline. And because of habitat loss, drainage of wetland areas, they are very much in decline. So they are red listed bird of conservation concern. They are, if any of you are familiar with visiting bogs this time of the year, if the bog is in any good condition and wet areas, you'll be familiar with the sound of snipe, which is this. And a beautiful sound to listen to early in the morning, late at night. They will call throughout the night, and I love their here in the west of Ireland anyway. I've heard their local name being referred to as the bleaching ghost in the sky. And when you hear that sound, some of the Irish names are far more descriptive and imaginative than the English names, and it really does summon up the bleaching ghost in the sky. And it's actually a sound. It's not a call. It's actually the reverberation of special tail feathers to make that call. But it is their territorial flight. So at this time of year now, obviously when they're when it's in the breeding season, that's an amazing sound to listen to on the bog. And really positive, we found snipe on as we expected to on all the raised bogs, but in very good densities. So breeding densities of 11 per kilometre squared. Another species, this was probably one of the most exciting findings, was redshank, and we recorded redshank breeding on 2 of the 5 raised bogs. This will give you, this is the map from the Breeding Bird Atlas. This will give you an indication as to how important those findings are in the national context. So redshank, the population estimated in and around 300 pairs, possibly even less than that. So the fact that they are breeding on 2 of the 5 raised bogs is of huge national significance. So that was a really positive finding. And they are obviously a red listed bird of conservation concern. Curlew, I'm sure you're all familiar with and aware and have seen the news about the decline of curlew and how dramatic that has been in the last few decades, really at crisis point, estimated about 200 pairs. And there has been a national survey this year that may even have a bleaker a population estimate than that, which we're eagerly awaiting. But again, we had curlew on 3 of the 5 raised bogs. So again, similar to redshank, just the national significance and just shows the importance of these sites and the value of restoring these for birds such as curlew, such as redshank. Meadow pipit, again, the most common species we recorded on raised bogs, as we would expect with bogs of these type in good condition. But again, really positive when we looked at their breeding densities, and they occurred in very, very good breeding densities when we compare it to other previous studies of other raised bogs. And then this bird, which you might have to strain your eyes to make out their masters at camouflage, which is the woodcock. Now, not a bird that breeds on the high bog itself, but we recorded woodcock on all 5 of the raised bogs in terms of the surrounding areas. But essentially, they wouldn't be there if bog wasn't there, even though they don't use the actual interior of the bog itself. Kestrel, which is, again, I'm sure another one which is much more beautiful name in Irish, and Pucraguiha, which means the wind puncher, which describes their hunting method of hanging motionless in the air as they survey the ground beneath, as they hunt, looking for small mammal prey or lizards or frogs. And raised bogs that are intact are ideal hunting ground for kestrels, and we recorded them frequently on all 5 raised bogs, both hunting on the bog and breeding close by in proximity. And they are still a widespread species, but they have been in decline and are a red listed bird of conservation concern. This bird, much more difficult. It's a close relative of the kestrels, another falcon species. It's our smallest falcon, and that's the merlin, and a much more difficult species to survey, and probably one of the most challenging species to survey and to find in Ireland. So we found this was the only species that I was a bit disappointed with in terms of our findings of on the raised bogs, and that we found them breeding on one of the 5 raised bogs, but we had hopes that they would be present on more. But it's a bird that we're really just starting to understand more about and learn more about, and you can see from the map there that there's large gaps in they should be on more of the raised bogs, and it was disappointing to see that they were only present on one of the bogs. But what was really positive. 1
more minute there, John.
Okay, perfect. I don't have too many slides left, so I'll just run through these. But in summary, what was really positive to see was that because of the work of the Living Bog project, they have really intensively mapped the vegetation, the ecotopes, as well as through their hydrological models. We were able to look at and see, even over the very short term, over a 4-year period, how the subtle changes in the bog in terms of the increase in the area of active bog, how that has started to maybe affect bird distribution and abundance on the bog, and then kind of looking forward and seeing over time, as the bogs become wetter and the conditions improve, how that may affect breeding birds present. And it was really good to see, in that what we saw was that typically within the wetter areas, and George described the different ecotopes better than I would, but the wetter areas, the wetter ecotopes and the wetter parts of the bog, more suitable for the open habitat specialists, the raised bog specialists, and the red listed birds of conservation concern. So when we looked across the bog, and then also looking at as further changes occur, that is looking like it will benefit those species more. So the likes of the breeding waders, the likes of snipe, which is hugely positive, and it just really shows the value of these restoration projects and of protecting what we have, or at least what we have left, which is a small proportion of what we once had, or what we should have. So very quickly, the conclusions. It was very comprehensive assessments of breeding birds, hugely enjoyable surveys. We're continuing them this year at some of the other Living Bog project sites, and we're also expanding it out to some raised bogs here in the west to compare, and really positive in terms of the findings, in terms of the fact that they're supporting these birds of conservation concern many of which occur in good densities, healthy densities, and compare well to other raised bog sites. So that is just a snippet of the work we did, and just some acknowledgements to the Peatlands Community Engagement Fund and also the National Biodiversity Action Plan Fund and the other funders, and that we worked with the Living Bog project, as well as Offaly County Council and Longford County Council. And thanks to Aoife and Connecting Communities with Peatlands for inviting me to talk. So thank you very much, and hopefully I was just on time, Aoife, if not a tiny bit over.
Oh, you're grand. No, that was really, really great. It's just fascinating really to see, you know, that kind of level of work being done. And, you know, I was down at Scullaboy Bog recently, and being able to, like, you know, sit in the silence and watch the meadow pipits just dipping up and down across the skyline is just fantastic. So thank you, John, for that. So we'll go to questions. So if people do have questions and they want to ask them in the chat, that's absolutely fine. I can put them to our speakers, but also you're very, very welcome to ask the questions yourself if you want to raise your hand using the chat function. It's the reactions button. It should be on your toolbar, and you should be able to raise your hand. If you can't find it, you know, just unmute yourself and physically raise your hand and draw my attention to you. So there are some questions already, surprise, surprise, in the chat. And hold on now, I'm just scrolling back up. So one of the main questions here is, where are we now? There are lots of praise for all of our contributors. One of the questions is, I think more for Denise, are hares found on bogs?
Not hares and rabbits, actually, yeah. Yeah, they can be, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I knew when I was going through it, I was like, oh, I think I'm forgetting something, and I was trying to think what it might be, but absolutely, yeah, hares and rabbits can both occur there.
Fantastic. There's another comment there on the otter spraint near the bridges, because they're obvious places to mark their territory and their boundaries. There's also a question.
And actually the National Otter Survey, they base their surveys around bridges because of that, because it's one of the easiest places to find signs of otter activities. But even in Abbey Lakes Bog, some of the sites where they had like kind of roads over drains and things like that, they can also be like a spot where otters will mark their territory. And any kind of a feature in the landscape, whether it's something man-made like a bridge, or even something natural like a grassy tussock, or kind of a rise, or some rocks or anything, they can be areas where otters will spraint. Something that looks obvious to your eye will be obvious to the otter's eye as well.
Very good. Another question here, John, this is probably for you. What invertebrates do curlew eat on the raised bog?
Yeah, very. I'm not on mute, am I? I'm not, sorry. Yeah, great question. So, obviously, you know, just by looking at curlew, you can see kind of they're designed for probing into the ground with the long curved bill, and the diet would typically be invertebrates, the likes of they feed on like worms, larvae, spiders on the bog as well, and also the wetter areas are really important. That's where they generally would bring the chicks, from breeding, but also some of the fringe habitats as well would be really important. So it's that mosaic of habitats and of feeding areas, as well as the suitable breeding habitat, that's really important for curlew on and in proximity to raised bogs.
Thanks, John. There's a question here actually for each of you, potentially for all of you to answer. The question's, what potential does Bord na Móna industrial cutaway have for increasing biodiversity in Ireland. George, you were talking about cutaway bogs and things like that. Would you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, it's I'd say they have pretty good potential. You know, it would depend on things like how low down do they go when they were extracting the peat. You know, if they went down, if they left a good thickness of peat at the bottom, then there, with a lot of those bogs, you'd have a good potential for restoring bog. If they've gone down deeper, then you're into the fen peat, and then you'll wind up with a different range of habitats. But then some of those could be quite valuable wetlands as well, you know, a range of different fen habitats. I've seen some of the Boardnamon restoration works, and it also depends on, you know, just how intensively they go at it as well. In some cases, depending on what the potential, you know, is, you know, they would simply block the drains, you know, and you get a degree of restoration. But in some cases, they go in for a much more intensive approach, where they do what's called cell bunding, create berms, you know, of peat, and block off cells and create little wet cells that way. Yeah, and those areas would have very good potential for bog restoration. You know, Sphagnum cuspidatum would be one of the first ones to come in, you know, and then as well as, you know, the hare's tail cotton grass would be some of the earliest colonizers.
Fantastic. Does anyone else want to come in on that? John or Denise?
Yeah, I think there's huge potential there, and I think it's really exciting looking at what Boardnamona is embarking on. And just as George said in his talk, like, I think, you know, they're very broad descriptions in terms of both cutaway and cutover bog, but within that there can be such a diversity of habitats. And say, for example, in some of the midland cutaway and cutover bogs, like, you know, you have species like breeding waders, you know, like lapwing and other species, even ringed plover nesting. Obviously, I'm sure you've seen about the cranes nesting in the Midlands. So that they do have, you know, a huge potential. I suppose these restoration projects are very much, you know, long-term projects. It can take a very, you know, short amount of time to, you know, for damage to occur in the bogs, but you know, they're long-term projects in terms of restoring them. So, you know, I think we're very much at the start of these restoration projects, and they require, you know, long-term investment and long-term planning. But I think the potential is huge, and it's great to see us embarking, you know, on that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. John, actually, while you're there, there's another question for yourself. Do you think that boardwalk incursions into raised bogs can have a detrimental effect on bird life?
Yeah, that's a really good question. If not planned and not if not planned appropriately, then absolutely there's the potential for, you know, increasing human activity, human disturbance on the site. And obviously, if that's not done correctly, then yeah, there is the potential for disturbance. But I would say that, you know, there are situations where that can have, you know, if done appropriately, it can have huge value in that, you know, as an educational resource, as, you know, showcasing the, you know, the importance of bogs, the beauty of bogs. So it very much depends on the site itself and the planning. And say, for example, you know, Denise showed Denise's, you know, initial image showing the boardwalk in Abbey Leaks Bog. The other site that I showed, Karen and Goppel Bog, they've put in a small boardwalk in an area that was already accessible from a track, and that's within, you know, a vast raised bog, a very large raised bog site. So and that's been used by the local communities, and, you know, can have a really good benefit that way. And that's, you know, that's a hugely important aspect, as well as, you know, I think it, you know, again, like similar with the restoration works, I think, you know, we're very much, you know, opening our eyes as to the, you know, as a country, you know, the just what we have, you know, available to us in terms of these raised bog sites, but also as well, unfortunately, the quite dark past that we have with them. So I think a huge part of that is showcasing to people, you know, the value of these sites and the importance of protecting what we have left, ensuring that we don't lose any more, but also slowly building back. And I think part of that is, you know, increasing awareness and appreciation. And I think, you know, aspects like, you know, boardwalks and it can be, you know, a really important tool. And I suppose as well, like, you know, it does then, you know, limit people to very specific parts of a site, you know, which could be beneficial in terms of reducing disturbance across the whole site. But again, you know, but it has to be, you know, obviously planned very carefully to ensure that there is, you know, that there is no negative effects, or that, you know, it's not in a particularly sensitive area or increasing disturbance to, you know, to species within, you know, within that area.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks for that answer. I think that was really comprehensive. Another question here is for George. Are there any of the plant life of the bogs threatened or endangered?
Yeah, you'd have several different species of mosses and liverworts that would be in the red list. There's a red list of bryophytes, mosses and liverworts. You can find that on the National Parks website. Yeah, but there'd be several of them. Yeah, I suppose my favorite one is a moss that it's called wavy fork moss, if I remember the English name correctly. It was considered to be extinct in Ireland until I found it a few years ago on Clara Bog. Clara Bog is probably the best studied raised bog in the country, you know, and so the fact that this species was thought to be extinct was hiding on the bog all that time, you know, just goes to show how much there is still out there to find, you know, that, you know, if you know, I encourage everybody to, you know, get out there with your hand lenses and your wellies, you know, and have a look, and you never know what you might turn up.
Yeah, that's it. You know, it's incredible how, like, as I said earlier, there's these things on our doorstep and we actually have no idea, you know, what's out there. You know, and actually to mention then, for the remaining people that are here at the chat, on Biodiversity Week, we're planning on going out and doing a survey on a bog with George being our guide. So I'll be in touch with more information about that. So we'll have that fantastic opportunity to be able to put some learning into practice. There's another question here from another participant. She has questions actually for all three of our speakers. George, is there any recommended ID guides to look out for bog species? You know, yeah, so something like FSC or similar for relative beginners.
Yeah, not one that's specifically for bogs. You know, for the flowering plants, you know, any of there'd be a lot of good, you know, wildflower guides, you know, that would be good for beginners, you know, so they would help you out. And in terms of, do I have a copy handy? I do. Yeah, hang on a minute.
Super. We get the visuals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and in terms of mosses and liverworts, like this is a fantastic book here. So it's yeah, and you could be able to find that in you know, I think Summerfield Books would have it, or you could look up the British Bryological Society website. So the mosses and liverworts of Britain and Ireland. So it's, yeah, I mean, mosses and liverworts, they're a bit more technical, but that's a handy book. And it shows that, yeah, you don't really need to be, you know, a super expert to start coming to grips with, you know, with those small little plants.
Fantastic. Denise and John, a question for yourselves. Is there anywhere that the public can record sightings for bog habitats other than the National Biodiversity Data Centre? Denise, you might answer that one first.
Yeah, as far as I know, like for wildlife and things like that, anyway, the data centre is the best place to record your records, because it's they take records from lots of local groups and things like that that might be carrying out their own surveys. But if you're not part of kind of like a local effort, I think the best thing to do is just to record the data directly to the data center, because they can use that then for generating their maps and informing different policies and status and things like that. So it's the best place to record it. Now, it's probably different for birds, all right, John, is it?
No, the National Biodiversity Data Centre as well would be like there is a few different ways to submit data, but to typically then for, you know, say for example, if there's a national survey for a particular species, say like there was just recently for red grouse, all that information would be pooled together. But no, I think the National Biodiversity Data Centre is probably the best place to submit records. So no, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I'm going to just do maybe 2 more questions because we're just past 9 o'clock and I don't want to keep people for much longer. Denise, what is the status of frogs or newts or lizards on the bog? Are they within safe limits?
Well, wetlands provide great habitats for all of those species. The likes of Abbey Lakes Bog, actually, they did a lizard survey there a couple of years ago, and they ended up putting out these, I think it was actually the Laois Offaly branch of the Irish Wildlife Trust coordinated it. But what they did was they put out these kind of like, they were like planks of plywood, and they had some kind of black felt over it, and it created kind of a nice warm area where lizards would like to hang out, and then they were able to kind of lift it and see if they had any underneath it, and there was a way for them to be able to record them. And in general, the boardwalks are actually a good way to spot lizards and stuff like that as well on some of the bogs, because they'll in the mornings, especially if the sun is shining, the lizards will come out and warm themselves on the boardwalk. So it's a nice way to be able to spot them. But in terms of their status and stuff, I suppose, like, you know, the more degraded wetlands and stuff are, you know, the less favorable it is for anything. So the more restoration projects and the more effort that we go to restore some of the wetlands and to make them wetter, the better it is for all of those species.
Thanks, Denise. A question here on sphagnum species. Are any of the sphagnum species easier to grow at home for a bog garden experiment?
Ooh, to be honest, I don't know. I've not tried it. Yeah, if I were to start, I'd probably start with Sphagnum rubellum, the little red one, because it's got, you know, yeah, it seems to be a bit more flexible than a lot of others in terms of ecological requirements. Yeah, but yeah, you want to keep it wet, you know, all the time. Yeah, keep the water levels up and fairly constant.
Thanks, George.
Can I just come in on that? I took a bit of moss from one of the bogs and put it in a little plastic wash-hand basin in my garden, and it survived. It's grown for years there.
Oh, great. Yeah.
It wasn't done on purpose. I took up some when I had some turf. There was a bit of moss in it, and I just threw it in there by the side, and then I later on saw that it was still there a few years later.
Yeah.
So it can work.
Excellent.
That's surprising. Yeah. Thanks, David. Yeah, George, there was also a request for your slides as well, if that's possible, for you to send them on to myself. I know we have this recorded as well on top of it, but there was just someone requesting the slides for themselves, if that's okay.
That's great. Yeah.
Super. Guys, I'm going to wrap it up because we're at 9:05. And I'd like to thank you all for coming this evening, for attending, and a massive thank you to our contributors. I learned so much this evening, so I'm just hoping that the 38 participants that were in the virtual room also learned loads. So thank you all, and have a really, really good evening and a good Easter weekend as well. So take care. And
Thanks,
bye.
Elaine.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Aoife.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
See you again.